Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture, brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
There are open mics here, so as you have questions, feel free to approach the mics, and we'll continue our conversation.
Way too many people got up fast.
That's exactly right.
These better be easy questions.
Yeah, I think I know these students better than that. I think you're in for a long night.
All right, let's rock and roll.
You ready to roll? Okay, well, we'll go over here where there are two, and over there's one. So we'll start over here to keep the lines balanced.
I would rather, this guy concerns me, so let's go over here. I don't even know him, but it seems everyone's affirming. Yeah, perfect. You can't say it. So as I was saying, yeah.
My question is, with regards to people wanting to be associated with Evangelicalism,
Yeah.
I was kind of in a decline, might not be that big of a deal. But do you think the issue of homosexuality and people's perception of the evangelical stance on it is affecting people wanting to be associated with Evangelicism?
Yeah, for sure. Evangelicalism is perceived on this issue as being intolerant, small-minded. I think depending on the part of the country you're in particular, the Gordon College situation that just sort of played out. Michael Lindsay signed a letter to the president that Michael Ware signed, who was Obama's faith advisor, about the desire to continue to receive federal funds, but actually hire according to their beliefs and practices. And they have really just seen a great undercurrent. They can't even place students in student-teacher roles anymore in some of the school districts in and around where they are, Salem, Massachusetts, places like that.
School districts that they have supported, and I mean, that's a really interesting story.
Yeah.
School districts that they have supported, poured funds into themselves as a way of expressing their involvement with the neighborhoods where the schools are, and completely those communities have completely repudiated the school as a result of their simply trying to live out their religious and biblical convictions.
Now I will tell you where I think this is going to go. I think that the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, polls on these issues. So the pro-LGBT, marriage equality organization, they call us evangelicals resistors to the current trend. There's not really a lot of shift in actual devout evangelicals on practicing evangelicals. You may have heard there was a PRRI poll out recently that the Pew numbers kind of probably contrasted to. But for practicing evangelicals, they're not moving a lot on the issue. Conservative Catholics are not moving a lot on the issue. So contrary to some of the things you may hear, that's when you just ask somebody, are you an evangelical? They say yes or no. But half of those people don't go to church who say they're evangelicals. The half that don't go to church are shifting some on the issue. But what I would say is I think you're going to have to get to the place where two things will happen. Number one, nobody cares what evangelicals think about homosexuality in Canada. Now, to the point where the Prime Minister of Canada is actually an evangelical. His name's Stephen Harper. He goes to First Alliance Church in Calgary. The CNMA have a very clear position on these issues. But it doesn't matter because you're not having a battle about marriage and about sexuality in Canada. It's over. And I think what's going to happen is I think on our current trajectory, within 5 years, gay marriage will be legal in all states. I think that battle will be over in the courts. And I think what happens is again, I could be wrong. I mean, people say the Alliance Defense Fund, we had a great conversation. They think I'm naive. But I think ultimately you can't hound 25% of the population that's not shifting on this issue, who are Catholic priests and Mormon leaders and evangelicals. It doesn't work that way. So I think ultimately you get to the place where you sort of recognize there's a minority that believes differently. I think the difference is we didn't used to be the minority on this, but I think ultimately we are now. The shift is really remarkable. We've polled on the data. Mm-hmm. It's remarkable how quickly people have changed their view on LGBT issues. So I think what's going to happen, though, is the United States is just going to get used to it. Much like nobody's mad at evangelicals in France because of their view on LGBT issues, because the culture sort of moved on. We haven't. We're in the middle of a great national debate on the issue. But I predict that next election, you're going to have one candidate who's going to be very aggressively, LGBT, marriage equality, in the Democratic Party, and I think you're going to have one candidate in the Republican Party who works very hard to say nothing about the subject, largely because the perception is the issue is a losing issue already. So the question is how do we as Christians kind of respond during that time? That's where it gets tricky. Do you fight what is probably going to be a losing battle on the legislative front? Or do you, if you've read the news this morning, some data we released, or do you say we're just going to separate ourselves from the state's definition of marriage? I don't know how evangelicals will play out on that. So for me, I think it's going to be a bumpy 10 years, but again, we've been on the wrong side of history lots of times, and that's okay. Jesus is still on the throne. The scriptures are still true. The gospel still needs to be preached. I preached at Pathway Vineyard the Sunday after Maine voted to. We have a Vineyard person here in the room, or you're just whistling randomly? Oh, that's right, you. But you've been like 9 denominations. All I can say is get a theology. And Dallas is the place, baby. But I preached there, and Phil Strauss, the new president of the Vineyard, was the pastor of the church. It's a great church, largest church in Maine. The Sunday after the state was the first wave of states that voted. Before, years ago, people used to say no state has ever voted to adopt LGBT same-sex marriage. Well, then they did. They couldn't say that anymore. Maine did. And let me tell you, the Sunday after I was there, I was after the election, they did the same thing they did the Sunday before. They preached the gospel. They loved people. They showed and shared the love of Jesus to a broken and hurting world. Nothing changed other than their context and the opportunity to minister to people remained before them. So again, I think it's going to be bumpy, particularly as Christians engage in these issues, but I think if we engage them well, winsomely, I'm not afraid to speak up on issues, but I think also we got to recognize that these are not our enemies. People have different views, and let's not treat them as our enemies. Sometimes I think Christians treat people who disagree with them as their enemies. I think they're not. They're people like us who need Jesus to change every part of us, like we do. So.
Yeah, I think the church can never forget that at the end, the gospel is about extending an invitation in the midst of whatever challenges the culture is putting before them, and being able to do that well is probably one of the core callings of a pastor. Is to make sure that the hand is extended even in the midst of places where there's disagreement about what someone should be doing with their lives.
And I think it's just tricky because we're just not used to that. We're used to being kind of the people who had the power. And what I would say is that's just not the case anymore. I got to change that slide because I can't tell you where we did this. But for example, when we ask, people think religious liberty is in decline. Both Americans and Protestant senior pastors think religious liberty is on decline. But I can tell you, let me just skip a few slides here. I can tell you that they're quite convinced. Many Christian leaders have talked about society being in a culture war. Again, not a phrase I use, but for our polling. Regardless of how you feel about the terminology, how would you explain the current situation? 59% of pastors, Christians are losing the culture war. 10% think Christians are winning the culture war. I don't know where they live. 11% say they've lost the culture war. So when we see some of these numbers, some of them are quite stunning. Do you believe homosexual behavior or practice is sinful? Has shifted just drastically over the last few years. Here's just a poll from 2011, 2012, where the biggest shift took place. I mean, that's a stunning shift in the views of Americans just in a short amount of time. And I will tell you that Americans are not with us. These are religious liberty issues either. They think Americans believe that Catholic and other religious schools, hospitals, and charities should be required to provide their employees with health care coverage that includes contraception and birth control at no cost, even if it violates their religious convictions. So I think that a lot of people took a lot of solace in the Hobby Lobby decision. Mm-hmm. Americans didn't agree with the Hobby Lobby decision. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're going to have to figure out, we're going to have to come to a truce. Who's the New York Times columnist, the Catholic New York Times columnist?
Russ Duthard?
Yeah. He wrote an article on same-sex marriage called Negotiating the Terms of Our Surrender. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some truth to I think it's shifted from let's have a battle over same-sex marriage to how will we protect the religious liberties or the religious views of what really is a minority view.
I can't remember the name of the author right now off the top of my head, but there's a wonderful book on the rise and fall of religious freedom in America. It was published through Princeton University Press this last year. And it is an excellent study of what he called the compromise that existed for 200 years in this country on the issue of religious liberty and in effect the tolerance that was created by that compromise, which he says we are now losing rapidly, and he expresses it as a concern in terms of where that's going to allow the rise and decline of American religious freedom. Who's it? Stephen Smith.
Stephen Smith, which if that's his real name.
Yeah, and that is a terrific book on the history of religious liberty in the United States.
I think it's Harvard, Harvard Press,
And so
I haven't read it.
Yeah, it's a really well done book. Anyway,
sorry, we got to answer these questions a little more briefly.
Yeah.
There's that guy.
Here.
There's that guy again.
Now,
why don't we go to this microphone over here? Go ahead.
Actually, my question is kind of easier.
I like you already.
I see that evangelicals are widely unknown by most of our population in the United States. They wouldn't even understand, don't even know how to define us.
Yeah.
And so, why is that, and what do we do about that?
Well, I think most people don't. They don't know. They don't use the term. That's an insider language. The whole term is insider language. They think of Christians, and then we sort of have this view that there's a whole bunch of people who say they're Christians that really aren't, which is really weird to a lot of people. So I was talking to Luis Palau, and I was interviewing Luis Palau. So Luis Palau, the Latino Billy Graham, et cetera. And he's friends with the Pope, which is kind of cool no matter who you are. If you're friends with the Pope, I want to hang out with the Pope. I'm from New York City, so we say the Pope.
The Pope.
So I asked him on camera. I asked him beforehand if I could ask him, and I asked him, so you've known this guy for 20 years, you've been prayer partners, you get together regularly for whatever lunch, and I really asked. I nuanced it really well. So I say, in the grand tradition, we know that there's just different denominations, identify as Christian. But as an evangelical, you think people need to be born again, right? You think people, yes, people need to be saved. And so I asked him, I said, and I nuanced it, I was really careful. I said, so do you think that Pope Francis is, in your and our understanding of the evangelical view of being born again and converted, et cetera, that he is a brother in Christ, a born again believer? And I asked him beforehand if I could ask this question, because I don't think you should just throw somebody under the proverbial bus. I had Kirk Cameron recently on my TV show, and I asked him, did he really believe in a pre-tribulational rapture now that he hangs around with all these Calvinists? And I told him I was going to ask him before he gave me permission to ask it. So you can watch him dance around the question for 7 minutes on video if you're so inclined. Just Google his name and my name. But oh, sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned a pre-tribulation rapture. Sorry. It's good. There's nothing wrong with it. But
you'll be gone soon enough.
I'll be gone soon. Exactly. Left behind. But he said, and he kind of said, well, I got a lot of friends who are communists, and I got a lot of friends who are Catholics. I got a lot of this, and he said all this sort of stuff. So I said, so what's the answer? And he said, yes. And what was fascinating was two things. It's the most watched clip that we've ever put out. There's thousands upon thousands of people watch this clip. And then the other thing was the backlash I got for asking the question, which is fascinating. I mean, from a lot of reporters, I work a lot with reporters. How dare you ask if the Pope is a Christian? And I totally get why that's offensive to people. But as evangelicals, we do believe that you can be a religious leader. You could be. Many of you in this room, if I asked you, said, do you know so-and-so is the president of this denomination? And you know if they're a Christian, you'd say, well, I'm not sure. They've been a follower of Jesus or whatever. And so to the world, it's really a weird thing that people who are clergy, we would have questions of whether or not they're Christians. But I would hope that all of you would agree that you can be clergy and not be a Christian. So that's where it gets true. So evangelicals, because of their odd beliefs, right, there's a sort of sense that we don't know who they are or what they are. So if you ask most Americans, they don't know how to define evangelical. Now, you tried to change the definition of evangelical, moved away from politics, which I think was good. It was good. I think the difficulty is, it's hard to do that because evangelicals really do believe politically with a remarkable correlation the same thing. So if you called evangelicals purple, let's say they're purples now, they're going to end up being identified politically as a bloc because evangelicals really tend to vote the same way, overwhelmingly with a high level of correlation. So your problem is not evangelicals being identified with politics. The problem is evangelicals voting the same. And so thus they get identified as a voting bloc. But to your question, I think ultimately, I'm not sure that saving evangelicalism as a word is really a worthwhile journey. I think that I'm more interested, as the world identifies less as being Christian, which is what's happening. The nominal Christians are dropping the term and they're becoming the nuns, the none of the aboves. As that happens, I think that we can reclaim Christian. And I think that's a better place and space to be, to talk about what it really means to be a genuine follower of Jesus, genuine Christian, rather than emphasize the flavor that we are. Now, I do see myself as evangelical. If you look at my Facebook page, it says Evangelical. That's the language. I'm on the board of the NAE. I think it's words worth keeping, but I think ultimately I'll defend the word, I'll describe it, but ultimately I want to talk to myself as a Christian, a person who follows Jesus with my neighbors and my friends.
And isn't the point of the question, which is how do evangelicals become visible? Isn't the point of the question, the way you become visible is not, there are certain things you don't do. You don't retreat.
Yeah.
You don't disengage.
Yeah.
You don't enter into your own privatized bubble world that keeps you safe from everything that's around you. The way you become visible and have a presence, if I can say it that way, is by moving in circles and engaging with people in the institutions of life in which we all function in one way or another, and hopefully do so with a presence that is winsome. We've used that word a lot, but that also leaves no doubt that you care about the people that you're interacting with. Again, even in the context of sometimes being honest and challenging them. You know, earlier we were talking about we're becoming a minority. Some people have made the observation that what's happening to the church today in the United States might be good. And the reason it's good is because it puts us in the position of being more like the way the early church is. And sometimes the church does better when it doesn't have power than when it does.
Every time the church has power, it tends to do poorly with it. So it's a question of how they exercise that. Yeah, I think so. I think that I kind of buy into the Kuyperian vision that there's spheres of society and we should be intentionally engaging those spheres of society. Now, we're at a seminary, so this is a kind of a one sphere, kind of a more narrow sphere. But I think as you pastor churches, you want to encourage people to be godly lawyers and godly filmmakers.
That's why the faith work movement is so important.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. We're on this side now.
What you're saying kind of leads to my question. As someone going out into the pastorate and I'm looking for jobs, if anyone hears of anything. How do you balance the fact that there are people we are evangelicals? I have a flag. I even planted it in my yard. I'm evangelicals. Who are the people I'm trying to get a job from? And understanding that you're reaching a population that either one doesn't know what an evangelical is or what an evangelical stands for, or if they hear the term, they think they hate evangelicals, which is something I've encountered a lot being from the Northeast. I can't use that term. So how do we balance a population in the church that may really hold on to that while reaching some who think that label is a terrible, horrible,
where are you
very
from,
bad thing? Connecticut.
Yeah. Wow. It appears. We really don't go woo-wee in Connecticut. It's more of an Arkansas thing. Okay, it's a Liberty thing. That's true. Yeah, I've been in Liberty Combo. You just spoke in Liberty Combo.
Yeah, that's
too.
right.
It's kind of a fun room.
Yeah, it is. It's great.
It's again. I don't carry the banner of evangelicalism. I carry the banner of Christ, and I am an evangelical because that term defines well my belief system. I'm not Roman Catholic. I'm not Orthodox. My parents are Eastern Orthodox in the Antiochian tradition. I'm not that. I'm an evangelical, and so I kind of move in and among evangelicals. So if someone asks me, I say I'm an evangelical. Now, where you're from, you're right, Connecticut. I mean, it's going to be a higher negativity. The Northeast is going to be particularly negative towards evangelicals. What I would say is, I think the bigger concern is the former thing you mentioned, is churches that just want to go to battle and people. I think it's really important to note that you're kind of here in this articulate, winsome environment. You're talking about engaging culture. There's people like Darrell and others, and teaching you to lead well and engage the culture well. That's not what people are learning. Our people are not watching television shows that teach them that, or news stations that teach them that. They're not reading websites that teach them that. They think that godlessness has been stolen from an America that's basically Israel in their mind, and if they, they think, that if my people will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, that's talking about them. They think there was a compact that was described between the founding fathers and God, and this is truly a city set upon a hill, and that these evil doers have snuck in and stolen their country, and they're going to speak up and speak out and take them down. And all of you hear that, and you hear how ridiculous that is, but I'm telling you, that's the constituency of evangelicalism today. And so what I would say is because I get it all the time. People say to me, why don't you speak up on this? Right, even on Ferguson, where I said we should listen to hurting African-American evangelical leaders of why they have a different view. Because Fox News is on a 24-hour news loop, basically saying that people who say that are socialists or communists. That's the response that I'm getting from the evangelical constituency, and it breaks my heart that I think evangelicals are more influenced by certain websites and stations than they are by the Word of God. But I think that's a factual reality, and you would be foolish not to think that. So I would not rush in, because here's the thing, I agree with most of what they would say. It's the pathway they want to get there and the way that they're articulating it that's not helpful. So I mean, President Obama's not a Muslim. President Obama is not, part of a secret cabal. I get that President Obama does. Most evangelical Christians, the vast majority of evangelical Christians, are dissatisfied with President Obama. Okay, he's president of the United States. I teach my kids to pray for those in power. I'm thankful that he's a good father, and I think that's important. And I try to say, and whenever I say stuff like that, I get hammered. Why? Because sometimes the hatred of progressive views is greater than the call to love your neighbor for many Christians. And so what I would say is I would be winsome with them just like you're winsome with the world. And I would say, I'd put my hand on an arm and say, man, I totally get it. I get the frustration, but just so you know, the 50s weren't the dream time you thought they were. You should have been African American or Latino in the 50s, or a woman in the 50s. They weren't the dream time you thought they were. So let's recognize the world's broken. Brokenness is more evident now, but let's speak gently and lovingly and clearly and firmly, but let's do so with the love of Christ and the grace of Christ being evident in our speech. So I would speak to them, and I would recognize that you have to bring them along too.
Yeah, it's actually a major task, I think, because there is a lot of anger and frustration. There's a lot of complaining from Christians, and I think what I think you see in the model of Jesus is his attempt to minister to people, regardless of where they come from or how they're about. He sat down and went to a meal with a Pharisee just as much as he went out with the tax collectors and sinners. And what you do is you model and show your concern, and you talk less about it. Okay, over here.
All right, I have a question from the sound man in the back.
The guy, 92 denominations?
Ohio State.
This is a surrogate question.
And now he's going to Chandler's
question,
church
so
like everybody else in Dallas.
This is a channel.
Matt Chandler, yay! Please.
Hey, we go to the same
Matt
church.
Chandler
I
before he was
resent
Matt Chandler. God.
All right. How do the well-endowed mainline seminaries play into all of this? They're in influential places and have a lot of money typically, but do you see their influence decreasing or staying the same? How do evangelical seminaries sort of take over in prominence and influence as time goes on, or will they?
I don't know. Good. What do you got over there? Liberty University guy. That'll be an easy question. What do you got? You don't know how to take that. No. Yeah, I would say that mainline seminaries, most of whom, you got to remember, when you think of mainline seminaries, you think of University of Chicago, things of that sort. But mainline seminaries don't have much influence outside of their own spheres. Evangelicals have sort of taken over theological education in the United States. Of the 10 largest seminaries in the United States, I'm trying to remember, is it 8 of them? Depends how you count some of them. I guess I probably shouldn't name names that I'm not sure are evangelical. But the vast majority, 25% of students in the Association of Theological Schools are at Southern Baptist seminaries. So 25% of the whole are at Southern Baptist seminaries, let alone, seminaries like, Gordon Conwell or here or whatever.
That's right.
But what I would say is they're still seen as the place of gravitas. They're still seen as the intellectual elite. So for me, I have 4 seminary degrees. I have 2 masters and 2 doctorates from 3 different seminaries, none of which would be among the, the academic elites. So what I would say is, I think that there are places that are friendly towards evangelicals. Duke is friendly to evangelicals. I think Yale can be friendly to Miroslav Wolf's there, to evangelicals. So I do think it's good. Everyone knows students who come out of Dallas with that beastly 4 years. We're going to stick it to you and make you take 17 semesters of languages. Everybody sort of knows that you guys are beastly here, and so there's a real respect for the students and their preparation. So they could, to the degree they want to. But I would say, I don't think you're going to, this wasn't your question, I don't think you're going to take over those seminaries because their structures just wouldn't allow that. Will evangelical institutions have the clout? No, I don't think evangelicals are seen as serious academically or intellectually. So I don't think that they'll have the clout in their own institutions alone. I think, Wheaton certainly has academic, you're on the board there, but certainly I wouldn't say that Wheaton would ever have, to the perception of, for example, the mainstream press, be seen as a Notre Dame.
And you just injected the factor that I think the question ignores that's actually important. And that is...
You're kind of rebuking the guy's question for ignoring stuff.
Here's the point. There's a perception about which schools represent Christianity. And when the media gets asked a theological question, they don't go to the evangelical seminaries, even though that's where the majority of the theological students are. They go to the Ivy League schools, or they go to the main denominational seminaries.
With their 8 students each.
The really amazing thing is that if you ask what outstanding seminaries in New York City, we're talking about this in my office, okay? You think of Union, New York, but it's almost a defunct seminary in terms of how it's actually functioning. But that's where people will go. Why? In part because of the geographic proximity of a reporter being up against a deadline who rubs shoulders with these people, gets to know them. He needs a question to an answer before the deadline at the end of the day, and so that's where he goes. I still remember a conversation I had with ABC News people in which I said to them, when you talk about religion in the United States, you've got to go outside the Northeast to understand what's going on in America. There's just no other way to do this. And I said to them in the same breath, but I understand when you're under pressure why you contact the person that you know.
Sure.
And
so we need an evangelical seminary in New York City.
We need, among other things.
So Darrell Bock, I think you and I need to move to New York City, start an evangelical seminary. We'll call it Dallas in New York City.
That probably won't work.
No?
No, I don't think so. But the point here is that one of the reasons you're dealing in all this is this is an allusion to another reality that Ed was alluding to earlier, is the narrowcasting that you get. What you get is narrowcasting on television. Everybody's listening to their own tribal voice, if I can say it that way.
And the more news channels we have, the more tribalized we get.
That's exactly right. So they're not even making the effort to listen to what the other side of the argument is. They're simply engaged in reinforcing where they already are. And in the process, there's no real conversation that ever happens on a substantive issue in this country because of the way we're interacting with each other. No one in personal relations would ever think about relating to someone this way if we were talking about how I teach my kids how to interact with somebody on an issue. Yeah. And so we're completely dysfunctional in that regard. And you ask, why doesn't it work? It doesn't work because we haven't managed it as a society in such a way that we actually are able to have a conversation with our neighbor who's very different than we are. And that is a requirement in being able to live with one another in a structure in which is set up to have all kinds of people be my neighbor.
That's a good word. Let's hear from somebody who doesn't have facial hair. So let's skip over there. We'll come back to you in a minute, Liberty Guy. And there are three kinds of people in the world, men with beards, boys, and women. So anyway, go ahead.
Well, first off, there's been a lot of great information. I kind of feel like I'm trying to drink from a fire hydrant.
Sorry about that.
No, it's good. It's good. My question has to do with taking all this information about evangelicalism and translating it into how does that look in evangelism.
Yeah.
A lot of my family are not believers. And so one of the things I'm noticing in hurdles with having conversations about the gospel is that there's all these stereotypes and preconceived notions that they have. And so it's not so much throwing new truth at them, but rather undoing untruths that are already there. And so can you speak to some stereotypes that evangelicalism has, and how do we go about portraying an authentic, genuine identity and what we're about in portraying the gospel?
So good. Tell me your name.
Kara.
Kara?
Yes, sir.
Kara, good question, Kara. And what I'm passionate about, well, most of my family aren't believers. And for 30 years, I've been sharing the gospel. And I think there's simultaneously, Kara, there's two factors. I mean, many more than this, but two let me just address. One is the misperceptions. What do we believe? What do we really believe? And so sometimes then there's the correct perceptions of what we do believe that is rejected. And so for me, I think both of those have to be sort of addressed. So, I recently flew down to meet with my dad, who is not a believer. And when I say he's not a believer, I'm not like saying he's a Lutheran or something. Sometimes when you're with our people, you got to say that means he's like really not a believer. And so there's some misperceptions. So I talked to my dad about what it means that why did Jesus die on the cross for our sin and in our place? His perception was maybe he's an example, maybe he's a good person, and so sometimes or maybe evangelicals think you're all dying and going to hell, and because you're not good enough. And so I addressed the misperceptions, but then really for my dad, it was just he had correct perceptions that he just had different beliefs on. So so ultimately for him, he doesn't believe that sin is cosmic treason. Right, that it breaks the relationship, that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But since he has no presuppositional belief in the Bible, let's look at Romans. Let's go down the Roman road. Roman road would mean nothing to him. So both of those sort of have to be at work. So what I try to do in any kind of evangelistic conversation is to deal with some of the misperceptions that are there if they have them, and then I try to maybe undermine some of their perceptions or disagreements with that. And I find Tim Keller's stuff really helpful on this, sort of their arguments. How do you undermine some of the arguments, defeater arguments he calls them. You might Google Tim Keller defeater arguments if you're so inclined. But I think that's necessary today. When Darrell was a kid in the 20s, I mean, if you sort of said to somebody, you need to be saved, people would say, you're right, I do. When I first became a Christian, I was a young man, and I came home. First one I witnessed to was my dad. So this is 1977, right? So I come home to my dad, and we grew up Irish Catholic, and the Catholic Church was really the church we didn't go to. We knew where it was, and we didn't like Protestants. But I become a believer. I go to my dad and say, Dad, are you saved? And my dad says, saved from what? And I said, man, I don't know, but you need to be. And so in a world of the 50s, if I said, are you saved? People would have got that. Today, those words are 15 definitions away from having any meaning. Saved from, what does it mean? What does it mean sin? What does it mean to be dead in our trespasses and sins? Why did Jesus die on the cross for our sin and in our place? So what I would say is evangelism, we're kind of a harvest-oriented people in an unseeded field. Think on that for a second. We're a harvest-oriented people, so we think the standard evangelical pickup line for the last 30 years is if you were to die today.
Oh no! Don't go here.
I can't go here.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm going to follow up.
Okay. If you were to die today, do you know for sure that people go to heaven or to hell? Well, so I actually, one of the coolest things about my job is that if I have a question about something, I can actually poll on it. And so I actually asked, does anybody really think that way if they were to die today? And so what I did, let me show you real quick. This is why I keep my computer handy, because it's my ADD kicking in at any moment. Squirrel! And so I want to be ready. So we actually polled, I think it was 1,000 Americans, but let me see if I can pull it up here. And what we asked them was, how often do you wonder if I were to die today, do I know for sure? I'm kind of bothered I can't find this. I usually can find this much more quickly.
Can I fill in while you're looking?
Yeah,
'Cause it
go
might
ahead.
help you look.
Yeah, go ahead.
Then another element to this question is I think we have, and Ed's already alluded to this, a language that we use that's very theological.
Yeah.
We have to theologize our language and explain it so that people get what it is we're really going after. Let me use an example. Okay, big word for us is sin, only that's not how it's heard. When you say the word sin, what most people hear because of their background, sin. I mean, it's a very negative, it comes over with all kinds of negativity. But it's driving at a concept that actually most people buy, they just don't think about it.
True.
If you change that to the word dysfunction, which I grant is not the same thing, but it's at least we're in the ballpark.
Wow.
Okay.
Joel Osteen right
Yeah,
here.
that's right. If you change the word dysfunction, and you get people to ask the question, is your life dysfunctional?
Yeah.
You'll actually get a confession. Okay? People actually will acknowledge that their life is confessional because they'll acknowledge they have problems in their life, and sometimes
That's fair.
they mismanage their lives, and they know it. Okay? Now, if I can get a person walking down that road, and then about 3/4 of the way down, I say, well, you know what the scripture calls that oftentimes? Sin.
Yeah, that's fair.
All right. I'm in a completely different place.
Further back.
Yeah, that's right.
In the evangelistic
And
conversation.
you're working your way towards some level of mutual understanding, so that you can move towards some level of substantive engagement.
That's good.
And so it isn't to shy away from saying I'm never going to use the word sin.
Sure.
It's to build the bridge so that when you get to the concept, a person is actually in the position of being able to grasp it.
Okay, let me throw some numbers around because it makes me feel better.
Okay.
By the way, I think I stole the phrase harvest-oriented people in a unceded field from a guy named Chuck Kelly, just for full disclosure. So here's the poll we did, 1,000 Americans. How often do you wonder, if I were to die today, do you know for sure I go to heaven? I was stunned that 20% of Americans wonder that every day. I'm like, really? Really? Are we polling like hospital wards and military units about to deploy?
Now, were these unbelievers who were being polled?
This is all Americans.
Okay,
Matter of fact,
all right.
18% of evangelicals say they wonder every day, if I were to die today.
That's
would I
why
go to
they're
heaven?
evangelical.
Sweet mother of pearl. Kill me now. Yeah, exactly. But so here's the thing. And the EE people used our data too, so it's all good. They're not mad at us. They were at first, but anyway. But when you ask it a little differently, back to your point, Darrell, you ask it a little differently. Let's start not at heaven and dying, but at meaning and purpose. The numbers shift. You look at the screen. How often do you wonder, how can I find meaning and purpose in life? So to the point where actually now, well, let's compare them. The nevers are down and the dailies are up. And so so for me, starting at the right place, dealing with misperceptions as you addressed, but also dealing with correct perceptions, but just disagreements. And then ultimately, it's ultimately a question of trusting the Spirit to work. And it's not easy. I come from a family, lots of non-believers, but I will tell you, mostly non-believers in my family, right? So my mother comes to Christ first, and then later she gets married, and they kind of they migrate into Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, like a lot of evangelicals did in the 80s. I didn't, obviously, but the rest of my family are not. So, but I was here at lunchtime, and there's people from Pantego Bible Church here, and they have a church plant at a Pantego Bible Church. And I met the pastor, and he comes to me at a conference I was speaking at. He says, "Are you related to Bill Stetzer?" And I said, "Yeah, I have Bill Stetzer." When he goes to my church, "Oh, that's not the same Bill Stetzer, I can assure you." And it turns out it's my uncle who comes to Jesus in his 50s at a church plant in Texas, moved out of New York City with all of our family. And I would have never guessed. And so right now, there's my uncle and I both get to evangelize my dad. And so in God's goodness and grace, he's at work. He's at work. Aslan's on the move. So
here's another element. Here's why I really dislike this. If you died today, would you go to heaven? Think about what that actually communicates theologically about what the gospel is ultimately about. The gospel is ultimately about escaping a place, a very warm and uncomfortable place, and living somewhere else and sometime in the future forever and ever. It totally discounts the fact that I'm made in the image of God, that I'm here to actually function in relationship to God now, not just in the future. And I like to say there are really two ways that message gets interpreted. It's either the Jimmy Cagney way, you dirty rat, you shouldn't be doing that, and you try and set up the gospel that way.
Jimmy Cagney really resonated with the room.
I know. That's why I use the illustration. Actually, when I do that illustration, I do it two ways. I do the Jimmy Cagney illustration. That's for the over 45s.
The over 65s.
I do explain it's my parents'
to help
generation.
everybody out there. That's black and white on the screen.
Very good.
That's Jimmy Cagney.
That's Jimmy Cagney.
You dirty
that
rat.
actually is the picture I show when I preach.
I like that. I like that.
Because I want them to connect with the past. And then I use the picture of the Matrix. Okay, Neo. What's Neo doing? He's dodging bullets. And the question about the gospel is basically, how do I dodge the bullet of going to hell? And I'm asking myself, is that what the gospel is ultimately about? And I think when we poorly translate what our theology is by asking a question that works for us but doesn't work for the person we're asking it to, we actually do a lot of danger, even in setting up the conversation we want to have, because we're taking them ultimately to a place that, although has a slot for us, isn't really the place where the Bible is trying to take people, which is to reconnect them into an ongoing, vibrant relationship with the living God.
Nice. So your matrix evangelization plan, do you say, do you want to take the red pill or the blue pill? Is that
No,
your new plan?
because that politically puts us in a bad place.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Thank you for being here tonight.
That was a great
Liberty
question.
Dude, did you sit
Did
down?
we lose the Liberty guy? Oh,
Dude,
good. Yeah.
Dude, good. Stand up.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah.
On your feet. Sorry.
That may be an indication our answers are a little too long.
Oh, okay. We answer your question? Okay, sorry.
I was asked how to bring the gospel to the northeastern pagans.
Oh.
What you said has been kind of like principle-based. And
Yeah. Did you say the northeaster-based?
northeastern pagans.
Oh, okay. Good deal. So my people.
Yeah.
Are you also from the Northeast?
One of the Connecticutians.
Oh, oh, that's right. You're the, I remember
do
that.
me a favor, when you evangelize them, don't call them pagans. Okay? That's point one.
The pagan pool. But here, the pagan pool works for us. And I would say that in church planting and evangelism in the Northeast, you're going to have to recognize you're seen as outsiders. Particularly the farther up you get in the Northeast, the more outsider-ish you are. So go for a plan to stay a while. Show and share the love of Jesus to a broken and hurting world. Show that you have been changed by the power of the gospel, and that change is worth sharing. And ultimately, those who invest their times and their lives in the Northeast are some of the best people who are pastor and planting churches in the Northeast. So, good. Thanks. We'll go over there.
Hi. So I've noticed sometimes that the evangelical conversation in America can get mired in on itself and become kind of insular, and I was curious as to whether, whether there are insights from the majority world of evangelicalism in the majority world that would maybe, just shed some light on or make us think differently about how we're going about some of these things.
I don't really think we need to listen to the rest of the world. I think it's going so well here that, I think one of the realities is that my PhD is in missiology with a specific focus on Western culture. So I end up with sitting on stages talking to people like Darrell Bock and asking questions about North America. When you talk about the state of evangelicalism, I can show you the numbers here. I would love to show you the numbers around the world. We have an office in Brazil, and we're doing research in Brazil where just amazing things that God's doing. Now, there's always weird stuff too, and anywhere. Brazilian neo-Pentecostalism is not something that I or probably any of you would be excited about. It's not Pentecostalism, which I'm very excited. I preached last Sunday at Church on the Way in Van Nuys, California, Jack Hayford's church, former church. So, but just a different thing. So there's always aberrations in all these things that we wouldn't be excited about. But what an amazing thing God is doing. We are seeing in Central and South America, the most evangelical country in the whole hemisphere is now in Central America, far more than us. And it's just amazing to see what the Lord is doing there. Go to Africa in the last century. You cannot overstate the movement towards Christianity in the last century. The great story, often untold story, is the Christianization of Africa. Again, people say, well, what about the aberrations? There's always aberrations. Don't spend your life saying, what about the aberrations? Rejoice in what God is doing. In Asia, what a remarkable turn. How God has used, for example, the Chinese diaspora in such wonderful and powerful ways. Missionaries who were not having a whole lot of great success until Mao Zedong threw them all out, and then the diaspora becomes this, with the exception of Taiwan, becomes this outbreak of opportunity. And then back in China, and the Chinese government, in its way, breaking away from the missionaries, actually forced indigenous autonomous churches that then would multiply to the point that one of the great success stories of Christianity in the world is probably right now what's going on, depending on who you count, how you count, and who you listen to. 50, 80, 100 million Christians, to the point now where it's actually becoming uncomfortable in some communities. We've got to take down all these churches, these crosses that are showing up. That's not a sign of a country that is not growing when the government says, there are too many crosses in this town, let's take them down. And we can continue. So when you look at globally, when you go outside the West and you look at the rest, not in all places, but Japan is a counterexample. For example, at the beginning of the last century, 5% of Japan self-identified as Christian. At the end of the last century, 10 years ago, 1% of Japan identified as Christian. So it's not a success story everywhere, but historically, Christianity has a rooted geography-ness that changes, and it was certainly rooted in Jerusalem, and then perhaps to Antioch, and then to Rome, and then to Moscow, and then to Europe, and then to England, and then to UK. And I think the center of Christianity is now in the global South, and in an emerging expressions in the Asian context. And I thank God for it. Now, of course, we have when evangelicalism here has a cold, it impacts the whole world. I don't think it's healthy that we have a disproportionate impact on global evangelicalism, but we do. You look at the top Christian selling books in Africa, they're written almost all by Americans. The Christianity Today just did a story on that. That's not all good, but that's also it's not going to go away. Pentecostalism is larger around the world, but the Assemblies of God is the powerhouse around the world that people listen to. The Church of God Cleveland that people listen to. So I think we have to recognize that we have a responsibility to steward here, but thank God for what he's doing around the world. We're doing research now in multiple continents and multiple countries, and it's just neat to see what the Lord is doing. It's not where I spend most of my time. I wish it was, but God has a call on my life to be a missiologist to Western culture. But what I try to do, we haven't even talked about global missions. What I try to do is also recognize that one of the ways the church here is going to be the kind of church it needs to be less about itself and more about God's global mission anyway, to listen to global voices and then also to be engaged in God's global mission. So great. Thank you for bringing that in.
Your global voices question also raises what I think is a wonderful opportunity for students who are here. We have somewhere around 10% of our campus is international.
I was surprised at how diverse it was today.
Yeah.
Is that international students, or do you also have a lot of diversity?
No, there's internal diversity too, but but it is a lot of international.
It wasn't that way when I was here. That's right. 10 years ago.
It's places changing.
We have time for one more student question.
Okay. Well, let me. There's an important point I want to make.
In other words, sit down, young man.
It's this. That you have an opportunity to talk with students whose experience of Christianity comes from outside the Western bubble. I would take advantage of that opportunity. Sit down with some of the students who are here from other countries who not only have experienced Christianity in a different context, but who can look at the Christianity that you've experienced from both the outside and the inside with outside lenses. That will be, I think, a very beneficial experience for you to engage in that relationship.
Amen. That's a good word.
Yeah. So
I thought we had more time, dude in the green tie.
These are the mic.
Ramey? Is it Ramey?
We've got the mic questions, and then we're going table to table eventually.
Oh, we got to do that weird table to table thing they told me about.
So over here.
I'm excited about that.
Yeah.
This will be quick. So it seems like, at least in a Western North American, at least context, that a lot of evangelicalism is kind of running off of really shallow, at least in the local church context that I find myself in, that it's running off of theology that's kind of run off of bumper stickers and coffee cup, cute little cliches and things like that. So, but when it comes to especially things that you see in culture, like really...
Just for the record, I work for Lifeway, so we're not opposed to those things. But go ahead.
We used to be coworkers.
The briefer, the better, right?
Exactly.
We used to be coworkers, you just didn't know it. But
I felt that.
Yeah.
Like we bonded right there.
It was good.
It's a tender moment.
And so, especially with a lot of ethical issues that we recognize, hey, these are really complex. How do us, as especially pastors and Christian leaders, help our people to think more well nuanced and critically, and not just make broad statements that aren't really accurate or they're straw men on one hand, and then on the other hand, how do we help people who don't even care about thinking in those categories think that way?
Second question's harder than the first one. If someone doesn't want to go there, it's very hard to take them there. This is very, very simple answer, I think. Other than all that happens is you perhaps hope and pray that they end up in a circumstance in which they are forced to confront the complexity of what it is that they are dealing with, and they can't walk away from it. But other than that, it's very, very difficult. Your first question is a very interesting question, I think. And I'm going to hand that part of it to you.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I guess tell me your name? Chris, my former coworker. Did you get fired for stealing, or what happened? So you don't want to tell me? All right, it's not a problem. I understand. I can look it up. I can look up your employment record. Right back. I'm doing it right now. I guess one of the things that I think that when you leave seminary, Darrell, I think I may be disagreeing with you, Darrell. I think you're going to have to get used to that most people are thinking in complexity about other things other than their faith. And thus, you're going to have to be okay with the fact that what you want everyone to wrestle with, when you first start pastoring, you'll get out there and say, man, when you really think through this and wrestle through this, and people have been thinking through wrestling things in their home, with their kids, and at their job, and they just want to love Jesus, know that you've thought it through, and go on together and trust the Lord. And I think that's one of the things that for me, I sort of came out thinking, of seminary, thinking, man, we've really got to help people address complexity. And I think there are always some. But I think you'll find as a pastor that most people aren't want to sit around with you and address the complexity of cultural engagement or theological opinion or whatever it may be. And they just want to know, how do I love Jesus? How do I maybe reach my friends so they love Jesus? And because I got a lot on my mind already. And so what I would say is not, I guess I'm always saying, like, prepare to be disappointed. What I would say is prepare to love a people who really love the Lord, but don't love the complexity the way you love complexity as a seminary student or a professor. And I think one of the great ways, I sat across the table from a plumber in my first church. His name was Dale. And what he said to me was, I was in the inner city of Buffalo, New York, working with the urban poor and some who weren't. And he said to me, you try to make everything so complicated. I just want to live for the Lord. What do I need to do? I said, well, you need to understand who you are in Christ. Mm-hmm. And he said, and I actually really think you do, and I wasn't being flippant on that. It's not just the gospel's not you do, the gospel is Jesus did. Mm-hmm. And so knowing that, and he said, so I need to understand these things, and then I need to really genuinely live it. And I said, yeah. He said, so why do you make it sound so complicated? And since that time, I've decided that I've recognized that some people really want to wrestle through the complexity. Some people want to live for Jesus and to know what they need to know and live for Jesus from there. And I think it's okay to be either. And so one of the rude awakenings that I think a lot of students find when they leave a seminary environment is that a lot of people just don't think the way they've been thinking for the last, I say 3 years, but not at Dallas, for the next 4 years.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, on a good journey. And so that my exhortation to be is make sure that you're constantly holding up for them the beauty of doctrine, the beauty of theology, but also recognize that people are going to take it in different ways and different paces for where they are. And if they love Jesus, they understand the gospel, and they're seeking to live for him, that's pretty good.
Yeah, we may or may not disagree on this. I mean, I think that is a good word in the sense of don't take away from a person their central focus, that their goal in life, if they're there, is to please Jesus.
Yeah.
But the flip side of it is the moment they hit a crisis, what they often do is they call you or they write an email and they're looking for help.
Yeah, and that's the teaching moment.
And the short answer, I think, to your question is this: and I don't think this is a difficult concept to grasp. I think it's a difficult concept to execute, and I think there's a difference. We live in a fallen world. The fallen world is a messy place. Yeah. It is a complex place. It's the nature of being in a fallen world that introduces the complexity of what we're after. And part of what I think, if you can develop the skill of kind of going there a step at a time, as opposed to giving them the entire, fire hydrant all at once.
Like we did tonight.
Like we've done tonight, exactly. But if you can develop that skill of working in simple steps towards an appreciation of the elements of complexity, and you show how that connects to the actual complexities of life, people will take that journey with you one step at a time. I think the mistake that is often made is that we try and deliver too much all at once, as opposed to a step at a time. You have a rare privilege as a pastor to get, for example, I was sitting across from the folks at Bent Tree Fellowship, which is where one of the places I go to church. It's a complex story. And they're in the midst of a series on Hebrews in which the pastor has planned to take, I think it was said to me, 38 weeks on Hebrews.
Sweet mother of pearl.
That's right. Okay.
Here I come, Melchizedek.
Now, on the one hand, you go, man, what a luxury to be able to go that slow. But knowing the pastor as I do, what he is doing is he is introducing the complexity of life one simple step at a time, to where people can appreciate how, and he's talking about how messy life is and that kind of thing, but he's doing it in a very positive way while reinforcing their core commitment to who Jesus is and their love for Jesus at the same time. So I think there's a way to combine these things, but it isn't going to be the way it happens in the classroom, where I've got 5 or 4 minutes to unpack something that has been debated for 400 years. Okay, that's not happening well in that kind of an environment.
I think I like your answer better.
Yeah.
So I think we do disagree.
Yeah.
I did, but I think I like your answer better.
Okay. Well, thanks. All right. Well, that's the hour we're supposed to give to open questions.
Thanks for listening to the Table Podcast. For more podcasts like this one, visit dts.edu/thetable. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.